All right, so it's cool to have Brian with me today. Brian's here visiting the church. So he's my friend and co-host at the podcast that we do, so that's a lot of fun. Now today we are starting our doctrine on the series of hell, the fate of the damned. This is the way little subheading there, which is a nice warm fuzzy palate cleanser for today. But first, before we do that, I'm going to promote this, like I said, throughout. This is called Testimonies to the Truth. We are going to be getting that book and going through it in class. I think you should get your own copy. Dr. Lydia McGrew, I already talked about her, but she's a New Testament scholar that has written some great books on how to defend the historicity of the New Testament. And this one's meant for churches to go through it. I got my copy I've gotten 2 copies technically, but the first one was damaged by Amazon, pretty badly. So I sent it back, got my new copy 2 days ago. So I haven't started it yet, but I've read her other works. She does great work, but we will be going through this as a class. You get on Amazon for $15.99, okay? So definitely highly recommend checking that out. Now, of course, we are going about the doctrine of hell. And this is an interesting topic, and the doctrine of hell is interesting because, anyone online, just so you know, this is what happens when you have a live church and live classes, so just deal with it. So, anyway, so we are talking about the nature of hell, and there's technically 4 or 5 different views. I had a good conversation with a fellow apologist this last week, and he said that they were at a conference once, and they had 4 people presenting 4 different views of hell, and then he said it was really fun to get dinner afterwards because everyone was just just bouncing off of each other. And I was like, that'd be a lot of fun. But I am not going through all 4 views because, honest to goodness, that would take way more time than I have time to deal with. However, I'm going to present 2 that I think are you can make solid biblical cases for either one. Now, granted, because there's universalism, right, that hell doesn't exist, or that you might be purged in hell, but everyone is universally reconciled to God. Not only does our church reject that, I don't believe that. There is some biblical evidence for it, but that also means I think there's other passages you have to ignore for it. Like Romans 5 makes a good universalist case in a vacuum. So that's kind of why you have to, there's certain things I'm not going to be dealing with universalism too much because I don't think that's a big issue here. Also, there is this eternal separation view, which is the idea that, of course, that you rejected good, therefore you're just eternally separated from God. That's how hell works, and all of it's figurative. I don't think that's really strong either. However, the 2 big ones is the one that, you guys are all probably very familiar with if you're raised in the Western Church at all, which is eternal conscious torment. I will call it ECT for short, because if I say eternal conscious torment over and over and over again, I'm going to kill myself because it's just too much. That's what?
It's almost like it's a torment.
It is a torment. It's a very long word, like doctrinal position. That's also called just the traditional view, right? That's probably the one that we're all the most familiar with. And there's conditional immortality, CI for short, also known as annihilationism, which is the idea that God just destroys the soul in hell. So the question comes down to simply, is the soul mortal or is it immortal? Does it live forever? Does it not? That's the point. Now, I have already said last week, and I will say again today, I have, over the last 2 years, made a shift into being a conditional immortality or a CI guy or an annihilationist. However, I don't think this is that big of a... This topic is one of those ones that it's easy to have unity and diversity on this topic, if that makes sense, because bottom line is we're all just trying to make out parts of it. Now, you'll notice that it really depends what you think has the stronger proof text for, because some language, no matter what, with hell, is going to be figurative. There's something figurative in the language for hell every single time. And some of it is literal every single time. The question is, which one's which? Annihilationism focuses on the idea that the part of death and destruction is literal, but the part of smoke going up forever and ever is figurative. Now, eternal conscious torment will say the smoke and all that and the fire and eternality of all that is literal, but the idea of death and destruction when it uses that is more figurative because you're still alive being tormented. So it really kind of depends which one you think has got the stronger case for which. So we will just go through and examine them. Make sense? It'll be fun. And if nothing else, it's a tool on the tool belt. So The question is raised, really, what happens to those who do not believe? So, what happens to unbelievers on the day of judgment? No one will be called a heretic, by the way, in here, no matter where you end up landing on this. Fun fact for you, the CI view, or the annihilation view, was actually the dominant view in the early centuries. So like during Jesus' time, that was the dominant view, and before. And then ECT became more popular as time went on, and there's a reason for that. It's mainly because everything Israel went through, by the Babylonians, the Assyrians, and all that, they started kind of going, you know what? Destruction isn't quite enough. I feel like how evil these people are, there's got to be a little bit more something to it. So some of them started developing like torment views, which is like the idea of like, well, it takes 7 years to be free from be a servant, right? So it means that you're going to be in torment for 7 years before you're destroyed. So you start getting some of those views start kind of cropping up here, and became more and more popular, and eventually became the dominant view after Augustine, after he wrote his whole dissertation, The City of God and Others, where he just lays all this stuff out. And so it really kind of comes down into where you land, because they both have strong historical backing. Okay, so they're both very strong historical views. And but I will be pulling, as far as the annihilation view, I'll be pulling a lot from people like Chris Date, who was actually a professor at my seminary, and a guy named Douglas Berry. Okay, they're annihilationists, so I'll be using them to kind of prop up that side. The eternal conscious torment, or the ECT view, I'll just basically be doing from memory, because that's the way I was raised and I know it pretty well. So if you go, where are you getting that source from? I'll just say from all the years of tradition. Oh, cool, I love that. That's really fun. Not that there's a lot of really big, I just like having the pretty picture up there, but because I don't have a full presentation or anything, so I'm done doing those. Those take too much work, at least for now. All right, cool. It gives you something pretty to look at, though, like fire makes you feel warm. Okay.
You might need to take that joke down and shoot it.
That's probably going to be a recurring joke in here, because I cannot help myself. That's Brian. He probably has to edit out like 400 of my jokes every episode we do together, because he's just like, my gosh, Will is dead.
Usually 4 hours long.
So anyway, as mentioned before, I believe in conditional immortality. I'm a CI guy now. After long study and fence sitting and going back and forth, I eventually flopped. So you can call me a heretic as per the usual. But I do not make this a huge doctrinal issue. So I think all of us in here needs to understand that. I always, whenever I'm challenging something that's pretty traditional, I always try to give it as much purview as possible. So I will be honest, if you are still at the end of this and you're like, yep, I'm still ECT, I think the traditional view is correct, that's fine, but just keep in mind that a lot of people who do flip-flop to being an annihilationist, be careful if you just think they're all dumb and all that, because most of us were all raised ECT, so if you switch, it probably means that you studied that out pretty well, so just be careful. Just be careful, that's all I'm saying. So, all right. So, and I will say actually, that, it is a fun fact though, most people I know that have studied this deeply actually do flip, but not all. I have a few friends that still didn't, but we'll see how the rest of you heretics go. So, all right. So first off, there's some very strong feelings on this topic. Some very strong feelings on this topic. F.F. Bruce, in defense of annihilation, said, eternal conscious torment is incompatible with the revealed character of God. That's a strong statement. And then John Stott says, I find the concept intolerable and do not understand how people can live with it without either cauterizing their feelings or cracking under the strain. So you could say on the annihilation side, there's some very strong feelings by some of its proponents. But Augustine also said this, if both destinies are eternal, then we must either understand both as long continued, but at last terminating, or both as endless. For they are correlative. On the one hand, punishment eternal, on the other hand, life eternal. And to say in one and the same sense, life eternal shall be endless, punishment eternal shall come to an end, is the height of absurdity. So he calls basically the annihilation view the height of absurdity. Wherefore, as the eternal life of the saints shall be endless, so too the eternal punishment of those who are doomed to it shall have no end. So strong feelings. And then Trent Horn, who is a Catholic, easy killers. I'm not a Catholic, so I'm not a papist. Anyway, but he did say this: if the ultimate fate of the wicked is their destruction, then why did Jesus say that they will be cast into unquenchable fire or be consumed by worms and never die? It would be sufficient to say the damned will be consumed and devoured if hell only involved annihilation. But if annihilationism is true, then this means hell will exist forever even though no one will be there, which seems to be a gratuitous addition to God's plan for a new heaven and new earth. Okay? So you can tell that those are two quotes from both sides, very strong feelings, and one people are saying, the annihilationists are saying eternal conscious torment, or ECT, is questioning the very character of God, and Trent Horn in the traditional view, I should say, they're the ones who are saying that, yeah, but to say one list goes on forever and the other one stops is kind of stupid. That's kind of their thought, okay? So, which is, by the way, both of them, you could say, depending where you land, make decent points, but I think sometimes we get caught in rhetoric and not in the digging. So let's do some digging. So first and foremost, why this topic is important. How many of you guys have ever been asked while evangelizing the question of hell? People go, well, I just don't understand how loving God can be so loving that he tortures people forever and ever who reject him. How many of you have heard something like that? Yeah, right. So, and can you be honest? Can we be honest? That is a good question. Like, if that doesn't give you at least a moment of pause, it should. If it doesn't give you a moment of pause, you're either just being arrogant or you actually have studied it enough to have a decent answer. But it is also important because we want to be sure we are warning people properly of the fate of unbelief and rebellion, right? We want to give people the proper warning. So in apologetics, this question comes up a lot. Recently, I was in a Talk About Doubts call. Some of you guys might know I'm part of the Talk About Doubts team, and we schedule, people put in an inquiry on talkaboutdoubts.com on issues they're having in their faith. It goes to our guy, Dr. McGlatchy, and he sends it to those who are experts in that area, and we try to talk to them about it. So it's really a cool ministry to be a part of. And I was recently on a call, and this person had some serious objections because he only believed really in ECT, eternal conscious torment. That's all he was ever taught. And he's having a really hard time wrapping his mind around this with God, to the point where he's like, it almost makes me angry at God. So then what I had to do is like, okay, let's back up for a minute, right? And of course, if somebody doesn't have good answers or they don't have proper understanding of some of these things, those feelings can be understandable, right? So what ends up happening is that I walked through the two different views, and he just goes, oh, okay. Actually, that helped me quite a bit. I didn't realize this. So I'm told I'd send him some resources and all that. But he and others have been deeply troubled by the reality of hell. Not only that hell exists, but the concept of being tortured forever. Just because people, and here's the other thing. So there's two things I want to get out of the way right now. Just because people are offended, though, right? Just because people are offended by a truth does not mean we should shy away from it if it is the truth, right? So that's one of the big issues nowadays. Oh, that's offensive, so we just can't say it, right? That's a problem, all right? That just because someone's offended, the gospel can be kind of offensive, right? You're a sinner. You're a sinner. That's not nice to hear, but it's true, right? So then, however, just because something is also offensive on the flip side, just because it is offensive, does not make it true either. Hence, a biblical approach needs to be considered and options weighed against each other. Because there's this other thing I've noticed, especially in the online theology bro area, they're like, well, people just don't like it because it's offensive, and we're right because our belief is more offensive than the other. And I'm like, well, it's kind of silly too. And we should be trying to find the most offensive theology we can find. It's silly. So, make sense? All right, now how many of you guys are familiar with a man named Dr. Gregory Boyd? I knew you would. Do you?
I think so, yeah.
I think you do. So, Dr. Gregory Boyd, he has a really cool book called Letters from a Skeptic. And it's actually a compilation of letters between him and his dad. And his dad was a skeptic, and he was leading his father to the Lord. really cool, it's a very authentic thing to read through. And I'm just going to read you a part of it because this kind of shows you, even if you hold to ECT, how you can use annihilationism to help somebody into the faith. Because again, we want to we want to get to Jesus, right? We want to get to Jesus. That's our point. All right, that's got to be your goal. But this is what his dad said. Your last letter put my mind a bit more at ease about who is going to hell. But it didn't address the problem of hell itself. This is really the more fundamental question. Now tell me, what the hell, excuse the pun, would be the purpose of, these are going to keep going, by the way, in this class, just deal with it. But that was his pun. Would be the purpose of torturing someone eternally. What's the point? Obviously, there's no lesson to be learned, so it just doesn't make sense to me, Greg. And I'm not just at the point where I can pretend to suspend judgment about this. The character of God is on trial in my life, and this very relevant evidence which needs to be considered. So his son responds, "Dear Dad, you said it about as forcefully as it can be said. Hell is a real theological problem, I must admit it. To be perfectly honest, Dad, I've never been able to make sense of it myself. But I have enough grounds for believing in Jesus and in the Bible to accept that what they say on the matter, even though it doesn't make perfect sense to me." After several points, Dr. Boyd then goes on to say a fourth and final point. Dad, it is this. You wondered why God would not, after a time, finally put the rebellious out of their misery. Why doesn't he just perform a divine act of euthanasia and exterminate the damned? You should know that a number of very reputable evangelical theologians maintain that it is exactly what the Bible teaches. They maintain, on the basis of an analysis of the scriptural text, that the Bible itself teaches that God will ultimately annihilate all who are not in Christ. The punishment is eternal because it has eternal effects, not because it is endured eternally. Such theologians point out that only such a view of hell squares with all the biblical talk about the reprobate, perishing, right? Being destroyed, burned up like chaff. Eternal torture, in this view then, God's judgment and mercy converge on the same act. God judges the rebellious even as he mercifully puts them out of existence. So then the dad responded and said this, "Dear Greg, I've recently been reviewing our letters back and forth over the last 2 years. Greg, and I must say, we have really come a long way. Your response about hell really helped. I especially like the annihilationist view you mentioned. That was a major obstacle for me. It seems to be the only loving and just alternative. Letting someone go on strikes me as sadistic." Then he continued with a follow-up letter to his son after he became a believer, and he said this. "Well, as I told you over the phone, I finally took the leap. Hallelujah. Looking back on it, it seems that things really began to change for me when you convinced me of the Bible's inspiration and helped me make sense of hell. I'm not sure why, but I think it was at that point that I really started to see the light." So, in a sense, presenting an annihilationist view gave his father permission to believe God's goodness as true and brought him into the faith in Christ. Now again, just because something is less offensive doesn't make it true, but you can see how something can go like, okay, maybe this might not even be what I hold to, but I can at least present this as a viable biblical option, right? Because it's not, the Bible's really about how we interpret certain parts, right? That's why there's sometimes different views of different things, because it's not always as cut and dry as some theologians like to make it out to be. In fact, Brandon Thomas, man, he's not in here. Where'd he go? I'm going to have to harass him. Brandon Thomas has a book from his college right now called like the Moody Handbook of Theology or something like that. And he's reading, he's like, this frustrates me because it just says cut and dry, like this is what it is. And it's like, well, that's not, there's other ways to interpret this. So can we talk about those? But either way, Dr. Boyd, fun fact for you, I'm sure this doesn't surprise you though, he now holds to CI and defends it publicly. So similar to Calvinism, the question of hell brings into question God's character and his justice. So as ministers of the word, we ought to want to know what is true and be able to defend it. Make sense? Okay. This topic is difficult, and of course, this scares Christians. So everyone relax. Everything will be okay. Cal.
So the death penalty is more just than life in prison?
I mean, I guess the life in prison would depend if you were torturing them or not, so. What'd you say, Brian?
Better than Russian prisons.
Better than Russian prisons. Probably, yes, true. I mean, certain situations, I mean, if you're going to put me in life in solitary, I mean, just put me out of my misery, man. Good grief. So I think the first question we need to examine is the condition of the soul. Is it mortal or is it immortal? Okay? That's a good question because eternal conscious torment, or ECT, says the soul is immortal. It lives on after death. So either you go into eternal paradise or you go into eternal torture because your soul is eternal. It cannot die. But then the conditional, or the CI view, would say your soul is mortal and it can be destroyed. So let's examine the two arguments, okay? Let's examine those. So the soul of a person is that part of them that is immaterial. One might call it consciousness even, right? So some Christians say, yes, the soul is eternal. And they quote things like Psalm 23:6. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Well, that means I am going, my soul lives on. Ecclesiastes 12:7. And the dust returns to the earth as it was, and the spirit returns to God who gave it. Well, that's a pretty good proof text, right? The spirit is obviously separate from the body and goes to God. Revelation 14:11. This is actually a really strong text that we will address, but this is a strong text in favor of ECT. Okay, Revelation 14:11. And the smoke of their torment ascends forever and ever, and they have no rest day or night, who worship the beast and his image, and whoever receives the mark of his name. That's a pretty strong proof text for ECT, right? Like, hey, see, the soul lives on, is tormented. Ecclesiastes 3:11. He has made everything beautiful in its time. Also, he has put eternity in their hearts, except that no one can find out the work that God does from beginning to end. Now, what I want to say here is that we're going to examine some of those, like Revelation 14:11, we're going to examine later in this series, okay? I want you guys to know that we will examine that, because that was actually one of those verses that before I switched to CI, I was like, okay, I need to get a really good explanation of this verse, right? So, let's talk about philosophical arguments now for the immortality of the soul. So, Plato, how many of you guys know about that man? Plato is the one who popularized the immortality of the soul, actually. Fun fact for you. He's the one who really, really popularized it. He's a Greek philosopher, obviously, and he's kind of more like a general theist. Now, granted, Platonism is controversial. There's a lot of things in Platonism that I'm like, that might have a point. Other parts I'm like, that's not true probably, right? But keep in mind that the idea of the immortality of the soul is entrenched deeply in Greek thought. Doesn't make it wrong, it just is something we ought to take note of, okay? So, however, I will say I'm more concerned with a Christian outlook. So before we look at Plato, I do want to look at Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas is brilliant. I love me some Aquinas. So anyway, so he talks about the soul as the source of life of the living thing. I think that's a pretty fair way to approach that, right? So the soul is the source of life of the living thing. If it's the source of the living thing, then that means anything that is animated by the soul. Okay? Aristotle and Aquinas believed there were actually different qualities of souls even. So they believed there was a plant soul, which has reproduction, growth, nutrition, but it lacked the idea of rationality or sensory capacities, right? A plant has soul in the sense that it's alive. Animal, which is an animal soul, which has cognition, appetite, movement, reproduction, growth, nutrition. But let's be honest, your dog lacks morality and reason, right? So then there's the human soul, also known as a rational soul, which is intellect, will, cognition, appetite, movement, reproduction, morality. So spirit, which are and angels are called pure spirit. We are spirit, so who have a form of a body. Okay, are we making sense here a little bit? Because this book does not have a soul. There's no movement. There's no life. It's just an object. It's inanimate, right? There we go. Okay. So Then he says that we have this thing called a form. Now this is going to sound similar to Platonism if you guys know what I'm talking about. If you don't know what I'm talking about, bear with me for a minute, okay? So there's this idea of a form, which we have the form of a body, right? But are you your body? That's a good question, right? Are you your body? Well, it depends who you ask. A physicalist or what we call a substance dualist, meaning your substance contains two substances, a soul and a body, or there's the soul, body, soul, and mind view. Okay, bear with me, all right? But we have the form of a body. The soul informs matter into a human body. So your soul is what is informing your body, okay? It gives the body purpose. Soul shapes all the parts of our parts. So soul is also animating the body, making not just the eyes, but also making the sight. So it's not just your soul, it's part of your eyes. It actually gives you what you see, how you interact. Soul is also animating the body, making not just but sight, the heart, but also soul doesn't just make the heart, but it also is what makes it beating. Okay. So the idea of death on this view is separation from the soul and body, right? To be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord, right? So the rational soul is what gives us our vital activities. It's the source of a living biological organism. When the soul leaves, the body dies, okay? Which is why you have some crazy like near-death experiences, I think. Right? So we'll talk about that here in a minute. So how can someone account for life after death then? Well, if the soul exists apart from the body, then the soul on this view is not just consciousness, but the very form of our bodies. Although the human soul is the form of the body, the soul is not just that. The soul lives in a special way beyond the body because it knows and it loves, right? Your body doesn't know and love. Your soul does, okay? So an example of this is if I cut off your arm. I've been playing Dead Space lately, so you have to bear with me. All right. Anyhow, but if I cut off your arm, are you any less you? No. You're missing an arm, but your body's missing something, but you are not missing something as far as who you are, right? Make sense? So the idea that the soul exists beyond the body, that's a good argument for it. Aquinas believed that all the actions of the body are performed by organs except for the intellect and the will, which are spiritual powers, and they supersede the body. So, example, to know means to conceive of what he calls a universal. Bear with me, I know this is heavy stuff, but just it's important because of how this conversation is going to go as we move forward. So, a universal is like knowing something about a square. How many of you guys know something about a square? Tell me something about a square.
Where's a rectangle?
But not all rectangles are squares. That's four corners. All right, four corners, 90-degree angles. Yeah, right? So, but what you know about a square, and that knowledge you know about squares now applies to all squares, right? So it's a universal, okay? However, such knowledge cannot be accounted for by an organ, right? Right now, I have a kidney stone, which has been awesome. Not awesome at all. And let me tell you something, my kidneys don't know anything. All I know is how to put this lump together to make me miserable, okay? So this must be an act then of the rational soul. Are you guys following the train of thought here? Aquinas basically takes kind of like Plato's idea and Aristotle's and kind of morphs it into like a Christian view, okay? There was, who said it? This is one of the moments I wish Jordan was here. But the problem is a lot of people is they try to marry Jerusalem to Athens, but Aquinas basically married Athens to Jerusalem, if that makes sense. So he took Greek philosophy and put it where it probably more properly belongs within a Christian worldview. So Athanasius said the soul is immortal since it's not the body. The body dies, but the soul lives on. Others argue that if the soul is not immortal and does not live on afterwards, there really is no justice nor punishment for sin. How many of you guys have heard something like that? Right? So if the soul does not live on afterwards and God just kills it, there's really no punishment. So the soul must live on. Okay? And I've heard this argument, and I understand his point. I don't think it's as strong as an argument as some people think, but we'll talk about it as we go. Arguments for, now, here's the thing. The reason why I wanted to start with Aquinas' arguments and not Plato's is because when I read you guys Plato's arguments for the soul's immortality, you guys are going to go, hello, paganism. So here we go, all right? One of his arguments was what we call the cyclical argument, or opposites argument. The soul exists in the world, in this world, and is one that came back from another world. Rebirth. Okay, that's the idea. The world is made up of opposites. If the thing becomes biggest, it must have first been smaller, and so on. Whatever comes to be comes from opposites. This applies to life and death. Living things come from the dead, and the dead come from the living. Living and dying is cyclical. If it's not cyclical, the universe would only result in death. If it is be true that the living come from the dead, then our souls must exist in the other world. For if not, how could they have been born again? And he wrote that in Phaedo. So then, now you hear that? That's basically reincarnation. Okay? That's what he's saying. That in order, everything dies, so then that which dies must come back alive and must be in a cycle, which is why the soul must be able to live on. Which means the soul must pass into death, which brings us to his doctrine of reminiscence, also called recollective theory, which he says this: what we call learning a truth is really being put in our mind something that we have forgotten. Think amnesia, because it is possible to draw out of someone a true answer regarding something they knew nothing of, as if intuition starts a thing. Anyway, they must have acquired that knowledge through a previous life. The soul then, as being immortal and having been born again many times and having seen all things that exist, whether in this world or the world below, has knowledge of them all. He wrote that in Meno. So you it's kind of silly, right? Like, so reincarnation, therefore, when you die, your soul knows all things and it goes back into a body. And that's why people recollect things, and they start knowing things that they didn't know before, because the soul lived on before, and now it's just in a new body, okay? Some of you guys are like, what acid trip is this?
Is that where the term recollection comes from?
What? Do you know? Is that where it comes from? Yeah. Maybe. I don't know. I didn't look at that. Stop asking good questions. Stop. And then, now there's other ones that are more, I could say, more Christian that Plato made, like an affinity theory. So regarding the intrinsic character of the soul, which is partially divine in nature, the soul resembles that which is invisible and divine, and the body is merely that which is visible and mortal. The body is mortal, but the soul is divine, and thus outlives the body and is immortal. Something that most Christians would agree with, right? Formal argument, proof, also known as the proof argument. Souls exist because forms exist. Remember, we talked about that with Aquinas a second ago. Fire cannot occupy cold, and ice cannot occupy heat. It's not within its nature, not within its form. Life is necessary for the soul to exist and cannot occupy death. Life is predicated, dependent on the soul, thus the soul must be undying. To say a dead soul is to say it's the opposite can exist within it, because a soul cannot be dead. Fire can occupy ice, ice can occupy fire, and soul can occupy death, apparently. And he's arguing that this would be contradictory. To be a soul, it must be immortal. Otherwise, it occupies dead space, which is in contradiction to its nature. Okay? So are you guys understanding the argument a little bit there? That he's saying that soul is life. To say a dead soul is to say an opposite. Because soul is life, and to say it's dead means that now fire and ice can exist within each other, and that's just impossible. Make sense? Okay, Cal.
So then ideas can't be dead either.
Ideas can't be dead. I mean, I'm going to say, remember, I'm the CI guy, so I'm just going to agree with you. But I'm trying to be objective, Cal. But yes.
You're saying, like, aren't there different concepts of dead?
Yes, there are. Separation, and dead, as in dead, and yeah. As in what I'm hoping my dogs will do one of these days. All right. So now let's talk a little bit about what I think the Bible hints at, because There are Christian, what we call physicalists, meaning they believe that the soul does not exist apart from the body, and they would affirm when someone dies, they fall into what we call soul sleep. Okay, and soul sleep is not actually as bad as everyone seems to make it out to be. There's actually, again, good arguments for it. You just have to understand it a little bit. Chris Date is a physicalist. I'm not a physicalist. I'm still a substance dualist, I think. But I hold these metaphysical views with a hand half open. I'm like, all right, well, if you can prove it, then prove it. I don't really care. So some people put way too much stock in some of these more metaphysical concepts than they probably should. But whatever, it's neither here nor there. But anyway, I still think the Bible teaches some form of substance dualism. But that's just me. Anyway, but one of the things that the Bible seems to hint as to least the eternality of the righteous, which is that Abraham was buried, and it said that he was, quote, gathered to his people in Genesis 25. So, sounds like something's living on afterwards if he's gathered with his people. Of course, it could just mean his physical body is buried with the physical body, but it seems to be, I think, hinting to something more. But because also God says that he is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Therefore, in this view, the soul must live on. He didn't say he was the God of, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but that he is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, as if they still exist, right? So,
Well, Jesus makes that same argument
right.
in Matthew.
Yep. Look at you. He's over here like, I got it. Where's Joy? She's never. Okay. Anyway. But I was like, wait, I just realized, like, where is she?
He's teaching little kids.
Oh, she's teaching little ones? All right. I'll allow it. But wait, you say, Abraham was buried in a brand new cave that he had just purchased, and only Sarah was in there. So then he must live on. So when he was gathered to his people, it must mean that he was reunited with them on the other side. And in Genesis 37, Joseph is assumed dead. Jacob says, I will go down into the grave unto my son mourning. So it sounds again like there's something that's living on. But wait, Jacob thought Joseph got eaten and torn to pieces. As far as Jacob knew, there wasn't any Joseph in the grave. So, there's going to be a lot of morbid humor I'm telling you. So Jacob was claiming to get reunited with him on the other side, like Abraham did. Finally, the Sadducees pressed Jesus on the woman in heaven who had multiple husbands, right? Whose wife will she be? Remember, they asked that. So it seems like there's something living on, right? Some form of something living on. They don't care about marriage. They're leveraging a perceived contradiction in marriage to disprove the afterlife entirely. That was their agenda, right? So because actually there is like that view that they, at the time, that many would just live on and die, and that this is what we have. The Sadducees, that's what they affirmed, and so, same with the Athenians, if memory serves.
So at the time, was there a view that people would stay married in like heaven or whatever their afterlife?
Yeah, that was a part of contention, but the Sadducees didn't believe that there was a heaven at all. They believed in so they just believed you live and you died, essentially. Very encouraging.
That's why they were sad, you see.
I need to add that to my notes, which is why they were sad, you see.
So what's the use of being a good person in life and following the laws, all the laws that they had then, if you just die, if everyone just dies?
That's my curiosity. I'm like, what's the hope on that view? Like, what's the point of literally any of it? Like
who cares what you do then, if you're just going to die either way?
Right, that's literally my, okay. That's...
Die with a pad on your shoulder.
Good job, buddy.
I feel really good about dying as opposed to feeling really bad.
Yeah, I feel really good about dying. So anyway, remember, Acts 23. Sadducees only... I can only see Sadducees. Ben, you ruined it. You ruined it.
Whatever.
So Acts 23, Sadducees only accepted Moses. They rejected the soul, the afterlife, and the resurrections. Paul used this contrast to pin the Sadducees against the Pharisees. So Jesus knows that they only accept Moses. So he refers to Moses to prove that there is an afterlife and marriage isn't a problem. So what does Jesus do here? He appeals to a single present tense verb and he builds his entire case on it. It's really funny. That's why sometimes knowing the exact verbiage there is really important, okay? Which is why, when we're talking about that Psalm 95 from this morning of
It's also crazy that he's so concise. Like, he
Oh.
says, like, Moses said, I am, your Moses told you, I am the God,
Mm-hmm.
of, Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. So he's not the God of the dead, but of the living.
Right, and I love how you, that you literally just took that from Matthew 22, 30 through 32, which is I was about to quote, but I'll just let you take the thunder. Good job, Cal. So,
Such a good.
Moses recorded this long after Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were dead. Jesus' argument is that Jehovah claimed that I'm still their God right now, and I am, present tense, the God of Abraham. So, it's a challenge to the Sadducees. Jesus is saying, freaking ruined it. Jesus is saying, oh, you don't believe in the resurrection and the afterlife? I dare you to say that your God is the God of the dead. Go ahead, say it. Basically what he's challenging them with. And they wouldn't say it because they knew that he is not the God of the dead, but the God of the living. So if he is still their God, as he claimed, then they must all still be alive on the other side. Okay? So that's a good argument for the immortality of the soul. Now, let's flippity-flop this and talk about the mortality of the soul. So here's some of those arguments, okay? So the mortality of the soul. So if the soul is one with the body and the body dies, then it follows that the soul can die too. Matthew 10:28. This is, and what?
Let's go.
And do not fear those who kill the body but cannot kill the soul. Rather, fear him who can destroy both soul and body in hell.
But in that own verse, there's the duality. It separates it in the verse.
Which part?
Don't fear the one who can kill the body, but not the soul, because they're not the same thing. Fear the one
Right,
who
so
can
they're
kill-
still, oh yeah, I see what you're saying, yeah. So
The duality is present.
Mm-hmm. Right, exactly. So you're still seeing that substance dualism that I would, that's why I kind of affirm it, because it talks a lot about body and soul. I'm like, it seems like that's a strong deduction from Scripture. If we want to ever do a full deep dive on the substance of humanity, we can, but I'm just going to go substance dualism right and assume that in here. But if you disagree with me, that's fine, and we can have those conversations, and maybe you can school me. So, John's, what?
That's Matthew again?
Matthew 10:28. John 6:51 says, I am the living bread that came down from heaven. If anyone eats of this bread, he will live forever, and the bread that I will give for the life of the world is my flesh. So he's saying you have to do this in order to live forever. Okay? So Psalm 94:23 says, he has brought back their wickedness upon them and will destroy them in their evil. He will destroy them in their evil. Okay? The Lord our God will destroy them. God destroys the soul and promises immortality to all who believe. That's this view. That the soul does live on, but it's also destructible. And God only gives life to those, okay? James 4:12, there is only one lawgiver and judge, he who is able to save and to destroy. But who are you to judge your neighbor? 2 Thessalonians 1:9, they will suffer the punishment of eternal destruction away from the presence of the Lord and from the glory of his might. But we are not of those who shrink back and are destroyed, but of those who have faith and preserve their souls. Zach.
That seems like an oxymoron, right? Eternal destruction. So, could you break that down?
Oh, you're ruining my way later. But okay, I'll touch on it now for you.
Okay.
Zach, you're way too on top of it to be like, I'm not waiting. Answer this now. So eternal destruction would be in a sense, and we'll examine how we see that this language used in the Old Testament as well. Eternal destruction is just saying the finality of it, because if it also says like Sodom and Gomorrah, the smoke rises up forever and ever. Well, it doesn't. At least not that I know of, unless the smoking's still to this day. So it'd be a picture of utter destruction. It is done. It is final. It is complete. So the result of it is eternal, if that makes sense.
You know what the other side would be?
The other side would just be saying that it's because they pull from like Luke 16 and others that that sense there is we see this idea of torment, that the destruction is an ongoing destruction that lasts forever. So and remember that the idea of destruction depends which one you take figuratively here. And that's why I wanted to make sure I painted that up here. It's because what happens, you get this a lot, and especially since we're a dispensational church. So bear with me. Nobody throws stones, but there's this funny thing that I run into all the time, which is, well, I read the Bible literally. Like most of us take something figuratively somewhere, some way, somehow. Right? There's figurative speech everywhere. The question is, which part is literal, which part is figurative? That's the question. And so it's understanding that, because, I mean, even when you read Revelation, if you take it all literally, well, there's some really strange things that would be taking place, right? Like, there's definitely symbols. So no matter how, so that's what's funny when I hear people, I just read the Bible for what it says. I'm like, okay, but we're all trying to do that. So.
I don't know, I read Narnia.
Well, do you see a difference between a literal hermeneutic and a normal hermeneutic?
Yes, probably, to some degree. I mean, it depends what you mean by literal. I think we'd have to, because I think certain people are more hyper-literal than others.
I would agree. I think we all try to read the Bible literally, but we recognize figures of speech.
Right.
And that is the normal hermeneutic.
Right, which would be like a normative hermeneutic, which is understanding figures of speech, picture, genre, things like an author and historical background, all those things need to be taken into consideration, which is, what?
Hermeneutic is just understanding, interpretation, how you interpret, how you understand something.
Yeah, so hermeneutic is a fancy theological word for saying Bible interpretation, the way you interpret the Bible. So if you're ever hearing a theological debate with like, no, the hermeneutic's off. And so we're just saying like the biblical interpretation is off or something like that. Or the problem with that hermeneutic. So these are just kind of like the doctrine of salvation is also called soteriology. Fun fact. But don't get too lost in the jargon. I'm trying to not get lost in the jargon. But those are some things that are, so just so you know, this is when you can tell when you've been to Bible college and seminary because you get all the nerds around who are like, well, your soteriology is, I'm just as guilty. I mock it, but I'm bad about it. Like, I use a lot of the jargon. What'd you say?
I'm agreeing with you.
That I use a lot of the jargon? Shut up, Brian.
What's the word for doctrine of hell?
What's the word for doctrine of hell?
Yeah.
Fate of the damned. I don't know. Is there?
Yeah, there is, but I can't think of it right now.
Oh.
Seems to be
Usually
off.
whatever the word is in Greek and then just ology. Theology, angelology, pneumatology.
Teleology, something like that?
Know that I've heard of one for hell.
Is it Gehedonology?
I don't, that's what it would be, but it doesn't like.
Hadeology.
Ideology.
Ooh, sounds
I like that. I'm sticking to it. All right. All right. So I'm going to roll through here for just a minute. We should be out on time because this is just a good introductory thing. So J. Stott said this. It would, and in defense of mortal souls. It would seem strange if people who are said to suffer destruction are in fact not destroyed. And it is difficult to imagine a perpetually inconclusive process of perishing. That's a pretty decent point. And by the way, he is a former traditionalist, so he used to be ECT, much like myself.
AKA like eternally being destroyed, but never, or like eternally in the process of destroying, but never actually destroyed.
Right. So, I mean, that's like when I was trying to, when I was growing up, trying to figure out how the worm does not corrupt and the worm eats at you. Like, do you have like a Wolverine healing factor that just keeps healing and then he eats and he's healing and then okay.
Or
Anyone
is it-
have Wolverine? Okay.
Or is it a figure of speech?
Right. So that's the question. So at the judgment, all souls are destroyed, which is why it is called the second death, is this argument. So this would argue that only the body is destroyed in the graveyard, but there will be a bodily resurrection of all humanity, and the second death will not be until after the resurrection, and it is there that the soul will be destroyed. So we're going to talk about two quick things, and then we'll be done, because I hear the bell. So near-death experiences. So this is why I think substance dualism is a strong argument for it. These make good arguments for substance dualism, that mankind consists of body and soul. There's actually a pretty crazy story of a woman who died, and she said that she remembered seeing her body going up, and then on the roof of the hospital was a shoe. And she mentioned that when they revived her, and they went up there, and sure enough, the exact shoe, the way she described it, was on the roof. And this is affirmed by multiple nurses and doctors. So it's not just something made up, some crazy person who's saying, believe me, like, Joseph Smith with Mormonism. So it is actually a well-attested story, and there's some a cool book on near-death experiences. But however, they do not necessarily near-death experiences do not necessarily make a good argument for the soul's immortality necessarily, because annihilationism would say it's just destroyed at the judgment. Does that make sense? So it doesn't mean the soul doesn't live on still now, but just at the judgment it's destroyed. So we must look at Scripture for some answers. So I'm going to leave you guys with some questions real fast, and then we'll break and hopefully start answering some of these questions as we go on. Can God not destroy the soul even if he wanted to? Can he uncreate the created soul, thus making the soul indestructible? These are questions that are pretty solid, by the way, I think. Can God destroy the soul, but just chooses not to? Can God destroy the soul and chooses to do so? Is it where will you spend eternity, or is the question, will you have eternity? And disclaimer here, this series will involve looking at many parts of Scripture in regards to hell to try and answer these particular questions, okay? So I will compare, these two major views, and I will likely push back because I am a CI guy, but I want to push back not because I want everyone to agree with me. I want to push back a little bit on ECT because it is so dominant that I think sometimes we haven't had that palate cleanser of going, oh, I didn't even look at it that way. So if I seem like I'm pushing one direction, it's not just because I agree with it. It's just because I know when I was looking to this topic, I wasn't getting a really strong argument. I had to go digging to find the answers, okay? So if you see me pushing that direction, feel free to push back and it'll be fine. So I want to do this because I want you all to just challenge and expose our presuppositions sometimes. Because once you know where your presuppositions lie, you can have better answers instead of presupposing them. Make sense? Are we making sense here? Cool. So anyway, next week we'll talk about the terminology of hell, and then we're going to jump into a lot of biblical passages. Any questions or concerns or comments so far? Are your heads exploding a little bit? That's a lot of info. I burned through information today, guys, but you can definitely see there's a strong argument for the case of both, though, right? At least for now, right? You can at least go, that's a good point. Oh, that's a good point. Which is why I was a perpetual fence sitter on this topic for the longest time. Because I hear one argument like, oh, that's good. I hear another one, oh, that's good. And
so in this class, that's the first time I'd ever heard of that there's, anyone argue that there could possibly not even be eternity for
certain people.
For certain people.
Yeah.
I'd never even heard that argument my entire life.
It's becoming really popular, more and more, not really popular, it's growing in popularity again. Because it was the dominant view. And then as the Christian church, I think part of it was because all the cultural shift, like I said, with now it's tortured for 7 years. But then Augustine, and once we get Platonism in there that the soul must live on forever, then it turned into the dominant view because everyone kind of accepted
the secular world.
Right, because the secular influence became the dominant view, and Augustine, being a Manichaean before he was a Christian, definitely, I think, latched onto that, and he makes a strong argument for it, and so the church has always just been like, that must be it, and moved on. And now recently, because of scholarship and stuff, people are rediscovering the other view, that was a little earlier. But it's not to say, I will say this, it's not to say that ECT is not true, because there also is an argument from progressive revelation as well. So these are all things that we will explore as we go. So